We spent thousands of years eating plain berries and tough meat, completely unaware that the single greatest flavor enhancer on Earth was literally lying right under our feet as dirt. If you dropped an ancient human into a modern kitchen, they would probably ignore the steak, walk right past the fruit, and cry tears of joy over a 20-cent box of table salt.
We treat it like cheap garbage today, but for most of human history, finding salt was the literal line between surviving the winter and starving to death in the dark. How did a rock that tastes like burning somehow become the foundational fuel for every civilization that ever existed? The weirdest part is that early humans did not even know they needed it until they stopped hunting.
When our ancestors were eating wild animals, they got all the sodium they needed directly from the warm blood and raw meat of their prey. But the second we decided to settle down and farm grains, our bodies went into a silent, desperate sodium crisis.
Wheat and barley have almost zero salt, and within weeks of switching to a plant diet, ancient farmers began suffering from muscle cramps, brain fog, and intense cravings they could not explain. They were standing on top of massive salt deposits, starving for a mineral they had no name for, without realizing their own bodies were crying out for a rock.
Animals actually figured out the secret long before we did. Early hunters noticed that deer, bison, and mammoth herds would travel hundreds of miles along the exact same paths every single year, ignoring good food along the way just to lick muddy clay pits. When humans followed those tracks to see what the animals were doing, they found them frantically licking white, crusty soil. We took a bite, tasted that sharp, electric sting, and realized the animals were harvesting medicine from the dirt. The paths those animals carved out to reach those salt lakes eventually became the very first roads in human history, connecting the first human settlements together. That brings us to our very first major realization about how salt built the world.
You might think we started mining salt because we liked how it made food taste, but flavor had absolutely nothing to do with it. Before refrigeration, meat would turn into a toxic, putrid sludge within 24 hours in the summer heat. Ancient humans discovered that if you packed raw meat in dry salt, it did not just stay fresh, it actually became preserved for months or even years. Salt is a ruthless molecular sponge that sucks every drop of moisture out of bacteria cells, exploding them from the inside out before they can rot your food. Suddenly, a tribe could kill a single mammoth, pack it in salt, and survive an entire frozen winter without hunting once. That single chemical trick changed us from desperate wanderers into permanent communities.
But there was a massive problem with relying on salt for survival. The easiest place to get it was by evaporating ocean water. But early humans quickly realized that drinking ocean water made you violently ill, while eating the dried white crust left on the beach saved your life. Why would the exact same substance kill you in liquid form but keep you alive as a dry crystal?
It all comes down to concentration and the strange way our kidneys process water. Ocean water contains just enough salt to dehydrate your cells faster than it hydrates them, pulling water out of your bloodstream to flush the excess sodium out. But dry salt, when consumed with fresh inland water, forces your body to hold on to every drop of moisture it can get. Ancient coastal tribes realized they had a superpower. They could evaporate seawater in shallow clay pans, scrape up the white crystals, and trade a handful of dried ocean for an entire deer from inland hunters who had never seen the sea. This created the world's very first trade networks, long before money, gold, or written language even existed. In fact, salt was so valuable and hard to move that it became the literal currency of the ancient world. Ancient Chinese dynasties printed the world's first paper money, but it was backed by state-controlled salt warehouses, not gold. Across the Mediterranean, Roman soldiers were frequently paid their wages in physical bags of salt crystals, a practice so foundational to their society that it gave us the modern word salary. If a soldier slacked off on guard duty, his commander would say he was not worth his salt, an insult we still use thousands of years later. Think about how bizarre that really is for a second. Men were willing to march into bloody battles, cross scorching deserts, and fight lions in arenas, all to get paid in a handful of white crystals they could dissolve in a cup of water. If you had a bucket of salt in ancient Rome, you were richer than someone with a bucket of silver, because silver could not keep your family's winter meat from rotting.
But just as salt was becoming the most valuable substance on the planet, humans stumbled into a dark, terrifying mystery underneath the earth. Deep inland, far away from any ocean, people noticed that certain natural springs bubbled up water that was extremely salty.
To get to the source, ancient engineers in China began drilling deep wells using hollow bamboo pipes and heavy iron bits, centuries before the West had even invented basic plumbing. They drilled down over 3,000 feet into the earth, blindly probing through solid rock in pitch darkness.
What they brought up was not just concentrated brine, but a strange, dark, foul-smelling liquid that caught fire if a torch got too close. They had accidentally discovered natural gas and crude oil, completely by mistake, while looking for seasoning. Instead of panicking, the ancient Chinese engineers built bamboo pipelines to channel that flammable gas straight to their salt pans, lighting permanent underground fires to boil away the brine day and night. They created the world's first industrial manufacturing system, powered by fossil fuels, entirely because they wanted to make their rice taste salty. But pulling salt out of the earth came with a horrifying physical cost that almost nobody talks about today. Mining rock salt in ancient times was effectively a death sentence. Slaves and prisoners were forced down into narrow, airless shafts with handpicks, carving out massive underground caverns of solid crystal. The air was so saturated with dry salt dust that it stripped the moisture directly from the miners' lungs and skin, causing horrifying chemical burns and constant dehydration. Many miners died within months, their bodies preserved by the very mineral they were extracting, turning them into solid mummies before they were even buried. It is crazy to realize that the tiny salt shaker sitting on your kitchen table right now represents millions of hours of brutal, back-breaking labor throughout history. People literally bled, suffocated, and died in dark caverns so that future generations could flavor their lunch. But as salt production exploded across the globe, it triggered a completely unexpected medical mystery that baffled doctors for centuries. People who lived in coastal salt-producing regions were suddenly dying of strange, unknown ailments, while inland villagers who barely had any salt were living long, healthy lives. For thousands of years, healers had no idea that too much salt could slowly poison the human body from the inside out. They knew you needed it to live, but they did not understand that high sodium levels force the heart to pump against immense hydraulic pressure, quietly damaging blood vessels over time. It was a complete paradox. The very substance that saved humans from starving in the winter was quietly killing the richest people who could afford to eat it every day. The wealthy ruling classes were suffering from strokes and heart failure, entirely because they were heavy-handed with the most expensive spice in the world. Speaking of how salt transforms society, if you are finding these strange historical twists fascinating, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden history of everyday things. That brings us to another massive reframe in how salt shaped human conflict. You have probably read about great wars fought over land, religion, or throne successions, but almost every major empire in history actually rose and fell because of salt taxes. In ancient France, the king imposed a mandatory, brutal tax on salt called the gabelle. Every single citizen over the age of 8 was legally forced to buy a specific amount of government salt every week at outrageously inflated prices, whether they needed it or not. If a peasant tried to make their own salt by boiling seawater on the beach, the king's guards would hunt them down, slice off their ears, or hang them from the gallows. This vicious tax created a massive underground network of salt smugglers who risked public execution just to move illegal bags of untaxed salt across regional borders. The hatred for this single tax grew so intense over centuries that when the French Revolution finally erupted in 1789, the very first thing the angry mob destroyed was not the royal palaces, but the government salt collection offices. The revolution that rewrote European history and brought down a monarchy was largely ignited by a fight over cheap table salt. Across the globe in India, a very similar drama played out over a century later under British rule. The British Empire passed a strict law making it illegal for native Indians to harvest or sell their own salt, forcing an entire continent to buy imported British salt at high tax rates.
In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi realized that the most powerful way to break the British Empire's grip was not with guns or armies, but with a simple walk to the ocean. He walked 240 miles on foot to the coastal village of Dundee, knelt down on the wet sand, and picked up a tiny lump of natural sea salt. That simple, silent act of picking up a handful of untaxed salt ignited a national rebellion that eventually brought down the entire British rule in India. It is incredible how a tiny white crystal, smaller than a grain of sand, managed to dismantle two of the most powerful empires in human history.
But why is our connection to salt so deep that we were willing to overthrow kings and fight world powers just to get it? The answer lies deep inside our own evolutionary biology, long before humans even walked on land. Millions of years ago, our ancient aquatic ancestors lived inside the salty ocean, swimming in a chemical soup that perfectly supported their basic cell functions.
When the first creatures crawled out of the water and adapted to life on dry land, they could not leave the ocean behind entirely. So, evolutionary biology did something incredible. It trapped a miniature version of the ancient primeval ocean inside our own bodies. Your blood, your sweat, your tears, and the fluid surrounding your cells have almost the exact same salt concentration as the ancient oceans had millions of years ago. We are literally walking, talking bags of salt water, carrying our ocean origin around with us everywhere we go. If your body loses too much sodium, your electrical nervous system completely short-circuits, stopping your brain signals from reaching your muscles. That is why your brain is hardwired with a powerful, unstoppable reward system that makes salt taste incredible. Every time you eat a salty chip or a seasoned fry, your brain fires off a massive hit of dopamine, rewarding you for finding a critical survival mineral that used to be incredibly rare. But that hardwired survival mechanism has created a massive modern trap that our ancient ancestors never could have anticipated. For 99% of human history, finding salt required intense physical effort, dangerous trade routes, or brutal mining operations. Today, industrial manufacturing allows us to extract billions of tons of salt from ancient underground seabeds using high-pressure water jets with virtually zero effort. We took a mineral that used to be as rare and valuable as gold and made it so cheap and abundant that we throw millions of tons of it onto icy roads every winter just so our cars do not slide. We eat more salt in a single week than an ancient peasant would have consumed in an entire year, completely overloading the biological system that kept our ancestors alive. But here is where the story takes a truly mind-bending turn that most people have no idea about. What if I told you that the salt you eat today is not actually from the ocean at all, but from a terrifying prehistoric disaster that wiped out almost all life on Earth? Millions of years ago, massive shallow inland seas covered huge portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. As the climate shifted and tectonic plates moved, those giant bodies of water became completely cut off from the rest of the ocean and began to dry up under a blistering sun. Over thousands of years, entire oceans evaporated into thin air, leaving behind solid salt layers that were hundreds of feet thick.
Eventually, volcanic eruptions, mudslides, and drifting continents buried those massive salt plains deep under layers of rock, crushing them into solid underground mountains.
When you sprinkle salt on your food today, you are not eating something made recently. You are eating the dried, crushed remains of a prehistoric ocean that vanished millions of years before humans ever took their first breath. You are literally seasoning your dinner with the fossilized remains of an ancient world. And that brings us to an incredible paradox about how salt behaves deep beneath the Earth's surface. Under extreme tectonic pressure and high temperatures deep underground, solid rock salt stops behaving like a brittle stone and starts behaving like a thick, slow-moving liquid, similar to cold honey. Because salt is lighter and less dense than the heavy rock layers sitting on top of it, giant columns of solid salt slowly pushed their way up through thousands of feet of solid stone over millions of years. These massive rising structures are called salt domes, and as they push toward the surface, they bend, crack, and trap huge pockets of ancient organic matter around them.
Almost every major oil field and natural gas deposit on Earth is found trapped directly alongside one of these massive underground salt domes. So without those ancient evaporated oceans pushing their way up through the Earth, the modern fossil fuel industry might never have developed the way it did. The energy grid that powers your home, runs your car, and manufactures your clothes is fundamentally tied to the movement of ancient dried ocean beds. But the weirdness does not stop underground. Salt is also quietly controlling the climate of our entire planet right now.
In the North Atlantic Ocean, a massive deep water current known as the global ocean conveyor belt acts as the Earth's central heating system, pushing warm water from the equator up toward North America and Europe. This giant underwater river is driven almost entirely by salt density. As warm water travels north, it evaporates, leaving behind heavier, extremely salty water that sinks deep to the ocean floor, pulling the next wave of warm water behind it. If that delicate salt balance is disrupted by melting glaciers dumping fresh water into the ocean, the heavy, salty water will stop sinking, and the entire ocean current could grind to a sudden halt.
A minor shift in the salt concentration of the North Atlantic could plunge entire continents into catastrophic freezing winters within a matter of decades. It is terrifying to realize that the stability of our global weather systems depends on the exact same chemical balance that keeps a simple pot of soup tasting good.
Even in our most advanced technology, salt is quietly taking over the future of energy storage. Lithium-ion batteries power our phones and electric cars today, but lithium is rare, expensive, and environmentally destructive to mine. Scientists are now building next-generation sodium-ion batteries that replace expensive lithium with common, ultra-cheap table salt.
These salt-based batteries can store massive amounts of renewable energy from solar panels and wind turbines without relying on scarce minerals, potentially solving the global clean energy crisis using the cheapest rock on Earth.
We spent thousands of years killing each other over salt because it preserved our food. Then we spent a century treating it like cheap junk food. And now we are using it to build the energy grid of the future. From steering animal migrations and building the first trade roads to sparking global revolutions and powering modern technology, salt has quietly pulled the strings of human history from the background. We like to think that human intelligence and invention built modern civilization, but in reality, we were just following a trail of white crystals through the dirt all along.
When you look back at everything salt has done for us, it makes you wonder how many other everyday things are quietly shaping our world without us even noticing. What is one ordinary, everyday item in your house right now that you think humans would completely break down without if it suddenly vanished tomorrow?